Hi, I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is the Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Car, what's one of the most difficult things a missionary encounters?
So I believe one of the hardest things that a missionary can encounter is language and culture learning.
And on today's podcast, we have the opportunity to interview Dr. Sue Brewster, who, along with her late husband, developed an amazing program to learn language and culture.
Yeah, so we are so privileged to have her join us today. She and her husband developed the Language Acquisition Made Practical material called LAMP. And she grew up as a missionary kid in Venezuela and learned about the whole field of languages and using them for translating the Bible while she was there. And got really interested, and later on she married her husband, and they began to teach and write and do all kinds of work in this area of language and culture acquisition. She has traveled to about 100 countries teaching and consulting, and she also taught at Fuller Seminary for a long time. She just recently retired from that position, and she still travels occasionally to teach and consult in other countries. So we are honored to have her today.
I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So we are so glad to have you here, Sue. Can you just please share a little bit about your story and introduce yourself to our audience?
I am privileged to be an MK, a missionary kid, grew up in Venezuela. My parents went out in 1939 when they were just brand newlyweds and stayed there for many years, and then went to the island of St. Vincent and then to Spain, and had to retire in their late 70s when they were not in good health. So have a great heritage to be part of. I loved growing up in Venezuela. It was a great life for me. And then I went to college. And during that time, I really wanted to be a Bible translator. I studied Summer Institute of Linguistics 2 summers, loved it. Thought I would be a Bible translator, and then the Lord closed that door, and I went to Mexico to refresh my Spanish, and began to work with the assistant director, whose name was Tom Brewster. And I worked with him for a year, and found out we not only worked well together, but we fell in love and got married. So Tom was a very special guy. He's with the Lord now, has been with the Lord since 1985. When he was 18, he was in a swimming accident, similar to Johnny Erickson Tada. Broke his neck, was paralyzed from the neck down. He eventually got a little return in his hands, but considered a quadriplegic. Never complained about what he couldn't do. He just figured he would make the best of what he had and what he could do. He said to his rehab doctor, "Can I do such and such?" And the doc said, "Tom, you're only paralyzed from the neck down. If you can figure out how to do it with your brain, you can do it." And that sort of became his mantra. Okay, I'm only paralyzed from the neck down. I can do it. And by God's grace, he did do it. And he traveled around the world, and he got his PhD, and just a really special guy.
I think it's fascinating that you met him in Mexico. So he had already figured that out.
He went to Mexico because he wanted to be a missionary. And at that time, no mission boards would accept a handicapped person. And so he went to Mexico to actually find out if he could survive in another country.
Wow.
Wow.
And then he found you.
Then we found each other. Yep.
Yes. And started a whole world of language learning together. What did that look like?
Initially, we thought we would start language schools. Well, initially, we thought we would direct language schools that were already started and realized there were other people that could do that. So then we thought we would start language schools around the world. And then we realized there were just a lot of little languages that would never be able to support a language school. And then we got involved in the whole area of helping missionaries learn languages rather without having to have a school to go to. If they have a school, that's wonderful. But if they don't, how can they do it?
Yeah. So that's kind of was the impetus for you to start exploring how do we create tools, right? Rather than this whole, the big school model.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, can you share with us a little bit of how you guys began to develop the LAMP method?
We were teaching in Toronto every June. I think we were there for 12 summers, under the tutelage of Don Larson and Bill Smalley, who started I don't know if they were starting, but at that time they were directors of the Toronto Institute of Linguistics, which was a program not so much of linguistics, but training missionaries to learn languages. So for a month, we intensively worked with missionaries, usually 90 to 100 missionaries each June, training them in how to learn languages. And Bill Smalley and Don Larson were sort of the gurus, but there were other people on the team that were adding ideas and suggesting ways to help learners. And Don and Bill wrote a book called Becoming Bilingual, which is a very good book, but it's quite technical. And most of our students felt it was too technical for their everyday use. So Don suggested that people on the team, on the teaching team as we were, somebody would take up the idea and write a book at a popular level. And Tom said to me, let's us do it. And I said, no, we're not the ones, but apparently we were. So we started writing just some handouts. We were teaching seminars around the world for missionaries on language learning. And we started out just maybe 30-page handout, and then it grew, and then people said we need more, and we added more, and finally we ended up writing a book.
Okay.
And all that was done longhand as we were traveling around the world. So it was kind of an interesting process.
Yeah.
And to have two brains work on the same book can be challenging. But Tom was the big picture. Tom was the one who had all the ideas. He was an idea factory. And I was the one who kind of get it down into words and into sentences and write it with my long hand. So we worked well together.
Yeah. What influence do you think growing up in Venezuela had on the working on the LAMP material?
I think quite a bit. My folks didn't have a language school. When they went to Venezuela, they had to learn just through the people. And because of that, they developed very deep relationships with Venezuelans. Their community were the Venezuelan people. And I, growing up, my community were my Venezuelan friends. The team on the field, the foreign team, was small enough. We were never living in the same area with another missionary. So all of my friends spoke Spanish, and all of my experience was bilingual. And then there was a couple who were working in the Warao language, which is one of the indigenous languages. And I visited them and got fascinated with what they were doing in Bible translation and in learning the language. And again, obviously no language school. They were learning on their own, very much living in community with the people. They had a house with no walls, just like the people did. And their house was right on the river, and everything they did was going up and down by boat. And I realized the importance of being in community with people and not being separated from people. So the whole LAMP idea is learn language through relationship with people.
It's incarnational ministry.
Absolutely.
And language and learning, culture learning that allows you to really be the bearer of the gospel as you're with people.
wrote an article called Language Learning is Communication is Ministry, that if you are learning language in relationship with people, you can begin to have a ministry from day one with your smile, with your friendship, with your questions, and you don't have to wait. I've been in language schools and I've taught in seminars in language schools where students said to me, oh, I don't have time for relationships right now. I'm going to wait till I finish my year of language study. Meanwhile, they're not developing habits of relationship. The community is not developing a habit of relationship with them. So the whole ethos becomes, I'm here and they're there and we're separate.
Mm-hmm. And until I'm competent, I'm not going to engage, which I know from personal experience, learning a language is not, even when you feel competent, you still are going to feel like a fool.
Absolutely. And you will act like a fool, which is okay.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, that's good for us and good for the community to see us as real people who make mistakes, who are not perfect, who are not the wonderful white gurus, but we are one of them. We are under them in a lot of ways.
You want to go for it?
Well, just kind of talk about how then you've encouraged mission agencies and so on to implement the material and some of the results they've seen as they've moved towards that model.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing, concept of being involved with people, and that's certainly not new with us. You go back to Eugene Nida's book, Learning a Foreign Language, which was one of the early books on language learning. And he encouraged missionaries to get involved with people. Don Larson and Bill Smalley, their whole book was about being involved with people. But it's very easy when you are going through culture shock, when you're in a culture that you don't know, it's very easy to separate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole school ethos, a lot of schools discourage people from being involved in community. I was in a language school and the teachers said, no, we don't want the students out in community because they will learn the slang. They don't learn the classical language that we want them to learn. What do people speak?
Yeah.
They speak slang, they make mistakes. But the schools themselves will often ask the students not to get involved in the community. Where does ministry come out of that? It's very difficult. So yeah, we have encouraged mission boards, if their students go to school or if they don't go to school, to involve the students in the community, to involve the learners in the community from the first day. If possible, even living with a local family for a period of time to get deeply contexted so that your language is not book language, but it's real life language. And again, that's where ministry happens.
So how do you think the effectiveness in learning the language with kind of the LAMP method and that kind of philosophy, how effective have you seen that be?
It's as effective as the person makes it to be. And that's true of any program. Whether it's a school program, whether it's learning on your own, the effectiveness comes out if you're putting it into practice and your discipline, your persistence in learning. And yeah, it can be very effective. And it doesn't have to be by itself. If there is a school, if there are tutors, if there are books that one can use, you can supplement the two with the other. They don't have to be separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're seeing the LAMP method as a tool in the toolbox and a way
Precisely.
for someone to engage. So
yeah.
Can you kind of outline for us, maybe someone who hasn't read the book or isn't familiar with the material, what's unique about the material? Can you lay out some of the material for us?
The book is intended for the non-linguist learner. And so it's written on a popular level, even has cartoons and jokes in the margin. And it's written at a how-to style. So here's what you do on Monday. Here's what you do on Tuesday. Here's what you do first. Here's what you can do second. Yes, you can do it in a different order, but here's a suggested order. And so that it's a toolkit that people can take out and find ways to make it practical. So the steps are, the first step is get something that you need. I have been doing one of the online courses for Arabic. After about a week, I could not say, hello, how are you? Where's the bathroom? But I could say, literally, your grandmother is weird. Now, how effective is that?
Yeah.
So the first step is get something that you actually need and can use. And your first week is greetings and hello and small talk and that kind of stuff. And then it grows. The second step, so you get something that's practical, useful, you write it down, you work with a native speaker, you don't have them translate, but you talk to them about what they would say in that setting. So I don't say to my helper, how do you say, how are you? I say, what do you say when you meet somebody? What is the next thing you say? So you write it down, then you practice it. Next step. So writing it down, you get a really smart notebook, but you don't want to rely on your notebook all the time. So you practice it until you learn it, you know it. And this amount that you're getting daily is 1 or 2 sentences to start with. Later on, you can get 3 or 4, and later on, you can get 6 or 8 a day. But you start with really small, what you can chew and swallow and use that day. Learn a little, use it a lot. That's kind of our mantra. So you learn it. So get it, learn it. Next step is go out and use it. So you have a smart book, notebook. In the learning, you have a smart brain. But in the using, it finally starts to come out your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
I can say it perfectly in my bedroom, but I get out there and I begin to see a real person and I clam up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to say. And I look at my notebook and I finally remember what it is I want to say. But after I've talked to 8, 10, 12, 20 people, it begins to be natural. It begins to be real language and not just syllables. And so that you learn it, you get it, you learn it, you use it, and then you come back and you evaluate. What did I do today? What could I do better tomorrow? And what do I need to learn tomorrow? Based on my experiences today, what could I not say that I wanted to say? Okay, I can use that as my basis for what I want to learn tomorrow. And so with those practical steps, and there's a lot of details within the book on learning pronunciation and learning grammar and learning vocabulary, but those are the basic steps.
So trying to make it really practical and tangible and achievable.
Something that you can do in community where you're encouraged and they are encouraged. You know, that's important.
Yeah.
Because if they keep seeing you make the same mistakes all the time and not growing, they're not invested in your learning. But if they see that they taught you a new word and you use it, and the next day you use it with them, they're invested in your learning and they get encouraged as you are growing.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, you've been a lot of places in the world, met with a lot of missionaries and others learning language. What kinds of challenges are pretty typical that language learners are running into?
Well, there's the one challenge of people who say, you know, I'm just not a people person. I don't want to go out and talk to people. Where does ministry take place? Maybe your ministry is writing and not even talking to people, but if you want to relate to people, you've got to get over that hurdle of I don't like to meet new people. I'm somewhat of an introvert and I'm somewhat shy. And it's not easy for me to go up to somebody on the street and say, hello, how are you? But I realize that if I don't do that, I'm never going to get beyond that point. I'm never going to get friendship. I'm never going to get relationship ministry. I'm always going to be shy. I'm always going to be looking around at people and not finding anybody I know and walking on. And so there's that inner hesitation that a lot of us have that we just have to work our way through and do it. Or there are a few other people who are the extreme extroverts who don't stop talking long enough to listen and get it well. And so they make a lot of mistakes and they don't correct their mistakes because they're so busy talking that they don't want to bother with little thing like accuracy and growing in the language. So those are a couple of the issues that people face.
Yeah. I feel like I've also seen perfectionism be an issue of like, I can't
Absolutely.
speak or even try because I'm going to fail. And that fear of
Perfectionist.
failure.
I understand that because I would rather do it perfectly, but I won't do it perfectly without practice, without making mistakes, without allowing people to correct, not only allowing, encouraging people to correct me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
I
humbling
had an
thing.
experience once where I was in Malawi. I was learning a little bit of the Chichewa language, and there were two people. So it was a team of us learning Chichewa, and there were two people who really knew Chichewa well. One was the teacher, a Chichewa teacher, and one was a missionary who'd been there a long time. And I was learning a little Chichewa. You know what? I did not want to talk in front of those people because I didn't want to appear foolish. And I thought, now that is really stupid. The two people that could help me most, I'm avoiding them because of my perfectionism. No, I've got to go up to them and talk and let them correct me. And so, yeah, our perfectionism can very much get in the way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So you've got languages around the world. You've got African and other languages with clicks and sounds in them. You've got Hungarian with too many vowels and not enough consonants, and a lot of Eastern European language with too many consonants and not enough vowels. And then you've got Oriental, Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, and so on. Um, how do you help people walk through and kind of get over the mental hurdles of, oh, I don't know how I ever can do this, and then just keep learning?
I really encourage people to get pre-field training if at all possible. There are 2 or 3 places that people can go to get understanding of how your mouth works and how you can make those clicks and how you can learn those sounds that you've never heard before and how you can learn a tone language. So pre-field training is a really important part of it. And I think that some people think pre-field training is too expensive and why waste a month doing pre-field training, but it's not a waste. It's really foundational.
Hmm.
So there's some good linguistics training before going to the field.
Language learning training. Yeah. Yeah. Linguistics can be very technical, but you want somebody who does real practical training. People like Missionary Training International in Colorado Springs, they have a program called Compass in language learning. People like Lana Dickerson at Wheaton, she's got a program called Second Language Acquisition. And hers is online. You don't have to go there, but it's very individualized. They work with you online with your language and your issues and your things. Greg Thompson has growing participator approach. Again, pre-field training. Any of these pre-field trainings are just so valuable. Unfortunately, Toronto Institute of Linguistics is no longer functioning. Otherwise, I'd send people there.
Are you aware of some others in other regions of the world? Some other similar kinds of training?
I think that Lana does sometimes do training in other parts of the world. I think that Greg Thompson does, and I do. So we all do short-term things other places.
Yeah, I just know we have a very global audience. And so I want, if there's any other resources outside of the US, I want to make sure we highlight those.
Right. Yeah.
So what kind of motivates you to keep going? You mean, you've been doing this for a long time. So how do you hang in there?
I think the joy of seeing people have the aha moment, I actually can do it. Having people tell me, I didn't think I could do it, and I did it. That joy is very important. Love for the peoples of the world that will never be met without people going out and making the effort to learn their language, even though it's not easy. people who go to difficult places and not only survive but thrive. Those things just motivate me.
Yeah, there's obviously places around the world where climate, isolation, uh, other just the place they're living in, the predominant religion where they're living, and so on, really put a lot of pressure on the families. Can you just talk about that a little bit and how families learn to deal with those kind of pressures?
I was so thankful to have a dad who enjoyed the funny side of life. And when things were never easy in Venezuela, and when pressures came, rather than getting angry, my dad would find something to joke about and laugh about. And I think that he kept us joyful. And I think that that whole joyfulness is important for survival. Finding God's presence in the midst of it. My mother was very much a person who loved to write poetry to the Lord and devotional poetry, and that kept her alive in the midst of very difficult seasons. My dad was in jail a few times, and things were hard, and the weather was hot, and we didn't have running water, and we didn't have electricity, and we could have focused on what we didn't have and how hard it was, but my folks just focused on what God was doing and how they could participate with what God was doing. And so I'm thankful that we never made a big deal out of how hard it was and what we couldn't do.
So it sounds like you kept an eternal perspective.
Very much so.
And that allowed you to endure hard things. And sounds like that's the encouragement to our audience and those who are in hard places.
I love to read missionary biographies, and I often teach in the Perspectives program, Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. And one of the lessons that I teach is the lesson on the pioneer missionaries.
Yeah.
And how they kept alive and how they faced difficulty, and in the midst of it found joy, and in the midst of it found the Lord, and in the midst of it developed relationships with people. And yeah, I think that's crucial.
Yeah. When my wife was homeschooling our kids and we were on the mission field, and I was just so humbled by reading some of those biographies and realizing that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people whose names we'll never know, whose graves will never be visited, never marked, because they said, I'm going to go and I'm going to do what God has asked me to do. And some of those people died en route. Some people, there's just some amazing examples and amazing history for us to learn from.
The lady that you interviewed a while back, Dr. Mary, I mean, she's one of those that to me is one of my heroes. But I really enjoy reading how they stayed alive. And I think for many of them, for all of them, it was prayer and Bible reading. Two guys that were in Mao's Long March, and for a while they were in prison in the dark, and they had no light at all. And how are they going to stay alive? They quoted scripture and quoted hymns and sang hymns to each other by the hour. And I think between the two of them, they had something like 600 verses that they could quote. That kept them alive. And I think that for us to found our lives on the Lord and on scripture will keep us alive.
So talk to the missionary who's in a place, they're struggling with the language, they feel like they've worked pretty hard at it, but it's not coming to them, or maybe they're dealing with some of these things we've talked about, being overly perfectionistic or reluctant to be out. Just kind of address that person for a minute.
It's not a sprint. You don't have to know the whole language in a year. It's a lifelong habit of being a learner, of being in relationship with people. So I'm not perfect, but I can love the people and I can allow them to love me. And I can persist. If I am in relationship with people right from the first week, if I am loving people, even if I'm never perfect in the language, I can still have a ministry. I know an older couple, they are, I believe, both of them now with the Lord, but they were older when they went to a very difficult situation. And the mission board was reluctant to even send them because they were, I think, in their late 60s when they went. And the board said, you know, are they ever going to learn the language? It's a really difficult language. I said, they are such relational people that it's okay. And sure enough, they both developed wonderful relationships with people because he was an older man, having been a businessman and experienced. His language was not wonderful and he made mistakes, but the local men came to him for advice where they wouldn't go to the younger missionaries. But they came to him for advice because although his language wasn't perfect, he loved them and they knew it. And they knew that he could give them wise counsel, and the same with her. She got at times very discouraged with her language learning. And I said, keep it up, because she would send me emails, and every week she was visiting the women and they were visiting her and she was counseling them. And I said, you may never get perfect in the language. It's okay. You are having such a ministry with the women. Keep it up. And I think that's what I would say to anybody. Keep it up. Keep working at it. You don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, it's an attitude more than is the language perfect.
Absolutely. It's an attitude of being a lifelong learner and a lifelong lover of the people.
So if we are to look at the field of language and culture acquisition, what are some areas where the field needs to grow today, or some areas of need that you see?
I think it's just continuing to develop tools to understand how to help the people that have specific issues, personal issues, how to work through those. And I think people like Lana Dickerson with her individualized online courses, she's doing a lot of that. You know, okay, this is your issue. How can we work around it? How can we work over it? How can we develop? People like Greg Thompson with his growing participator approach. I think he's doing some of that too. So I guess developing individualized way of learning.
So it sounds like we need more Greg Thompsons and Lana Dickersons out there in the world, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes people go and they go to a place of service and then the language doesn't come easily, and that they think, oh, I'm not cut out to be here. I'm not the right person for here.
Absolutely. It happens way too often. And people quit before they need to quit. They could keep going and they quit. And I'm sad. You know, missionary attrition is huge. People start out and they don't stay. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is discouragement in language. And I've taught at Fuller Seminary. I have students, former students around the world, and sometimes they'll write to me and say, you know, I'm discouraged, I'm stuck. What do I do next? And trying to say, don't quit. Here's an idea. Work with that.
And I wonder if some of that, the expectation that we don't always fully understand what we're walking into in a new context, right?
We never understand.
I mean, but I think there's a perception that, oh, maybe some people have visited or whatnot, and they've created this expectation in their mind, right? And then they get there and it's so much harder than they expected.
Yep.
And I think that gap between the expectation and the reality is where so much disappointment and frustration lives.
And that's one of the advantages of the pre-field programs, is I think it helps build more realistic expectations.
What would you say are realistic expectations of language and culture learning? I mean, there's no perfect, you know, this applies to everything, but maybe some parameters.
That within a year of learning, you can be reasonably fluent in the language. You won't be perfect. There's going to be a lot of areas for continued growth. You need lifelong learning. But within a year, you can be handling a lot of daily experiences, some ministry experiences, and you can be in relationship with people. You can have some really deep relationships, even if your language is not perfect.
So beyond a year, what would you say is happening in year 2?
Beyond a year, the growth is not as visible usually in you think of a human being, their first year of growth, they're learning to walk, they're learning to talk, they're learning to eat, they're learning to do so much. The difference between, say, 16 and 17, you don't see that huge jump. What you see is a deepening and a maturing. And I think the same as in language. And in your first year is probably your big jump. From then on, you might get discouraged. Oh, I haven't grown much. I encourage people to, from time to time, record themselves talking with other people. A year later, listen to that and see if they've grown and see if they have a bigger vocabulary and a better understanding of what people are saying. And you might say, oh, yeah, in a year, I have grown a little bit.
Yeah. So having honest self-evaluation as well, instead of the critical,
by others
I don't have this
individually.
perfectly, so therefore I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I don't have it perfectly, so where can I grow?
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, language is complex. Like I speak Portuguese fluently, but there are parts of the Portuguese language that I have no clue. You know, I learned it as a kid, and that, you know, I know language all the way up to being a teenager, but my professional language in Portuguese is almost non-existent, right?
I
So
know the
language
feeling.
has so many different facets of it too. And
Mhm.
so recognizing what are the areas you need to have mastery of and be perhaps content with that.
And even to recognize that in our first language, there are areas that we don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There are a lot of areas. I was reading something the other day on a sort of a technical field, and I thought, I don't even understand half the words. And it's
Right.
English, supposedly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You get into fields, medicine, engineering, things like that. And it's like, I don't know this. This is a whole vocabulary I don't know. So, yeah. Anyway, do you feel like most mission agencies are doing a reasonable job in terms of prepping their people for the expectations or helping them get equipped? Or anyway, you're not looking happy.
I wish that I could say I do.
Okay.
I think a lot of mission agencies are still not aware of what's available out there. Yeah, I talk to sometimes at some of these conferences and stuff, and find mission agencies that are quite surprised to find that some of these pre-field programs or in-field programs are available. I wish there were a way to get the word out more broadly.
Yeah. So we will list on our website and on with the podcasts these resources that you've mentioned. Are there any other these resources that you would want to make sure that our audience is aware of?
I can send you the list of where you can get these resources so you can post. I think those are the main ones.
Thank you.
There is, if you're a language trainer, there is the International Congress on Language Learning. That is every couple, 2 or 3 years, where people who are involved in linguistics and language learning and language training, we get together and we share ideas with one another. And so if you're involved in any way in training, in preparing people, you might want to become part of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well then if you could send us a link to that as well, then we will make sure that our audience can have access. Because part of our vision here with this podcast is to get the word out, because we really do think that people need to hear about these resources.
Great. And it's nice to meet both of you.
Well, thank you. It's so nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And any last encouragement for our audience?
Keep going.
So, Steve, what was the takeaway for you for this conversation with Betty Sue?
That was a rich conversation. I mean, to meet someone such as herself with years and years of her missionary experience and then growing up as a missionary kid, I mean, it was just phenomenal. But I loved her parting words, keep going. And language learning isn't easy. I've been in the situation to learn actually 2 different languages. The first one we worked really hard at, and we had some success. And the second one, we weren't that successful. So just keep going. Those are good words.
Yeah, I was just encouraged as she was talking about kind of there are some really tangible tools and ways to go about learning a language. And I hope for those of you out there who are struggling and maybe didn't get the training, pre-field training, or the resources, that you can take a look at our show notes and kind of find some of these resources, because you don't have to keep floundering. There are ways to take steps forward. Yeah,
it was eye-opening to hear all the different references she made to people and seminars and so on.
So we want to equip you guys to be as effective as you can, because I love how she talks about how learning a language is a part of the relationship that we are working. We want relationships with people. We want people to come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Yeah. And that is the goal, that why the language learning is so important.
That's right. Well, thank you for joining us today on the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.